Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast. Teaching the Designer. Chapter 5, Learning from Books. In the previous chapter, we explored the emergence of the architect as a distinct professional figure. We examined how design gradually evolved from a collective craft tradition into a specialized form of knowledge requiring its own methods of learning and transmission. As architects increasingly came to be associated with both intellectual and practical expertise, an important challenge emerged. How could knowledge be preserved, organized, and shared beyond direct personal instruction? One of the most influential answers to this question came through books. For much of human history, learning depended heavily upon personal relationships. Knowledge traveled from master to apprentice, from parent to child, from experienced practitioner to novice. Expertise was transmitted through conversation, demonstration, observation, and participation. While these methods could be highly effective, they were also limited. Knowledge remained dependent upon individuals and communities. When a teacher disappeared, knowledge could disappear with them. Books transformed this relationship fundamentally. They allowed knowledge to be recorded, preserved, copied, and distributed beyond the immediate context in which it was created. Information could now travel across generations, regions, and cultures with a degree of stability that oral transmission alone could rarely achieve. In this sense, books did not simply store knowledge, they expanded their reach. This development had profound implications for design education. Before written texts became widely available, learning remained closely connected to direct experience. A student typically learns from the people immediately surrounding them. Books introduced the possibility of learning from distant voices, historical figures, and accumulated intellectual traditions. Education was no longer limited by geography or personal contact. The significance of this shift becomes particularly visible in architecture. Buildings are physical objects, yet architecture increasingly came to be understood as a body of knowledge that could be described, analyzed, and debated. Once architectural ideas could be written down, they became available for reflection in new ways. Designers could study principles, compare approaches, and engage with concepts that extended beyond their own practical experience. One of the most influential examples of this transformation was the work of Vitruvius. His treatise De Architectura, written during the 1st century BCE, remains one of the earliest surviving texts devoted entirely to architecture. More importantly, it demonstrated that architecture could be discussed systematically as a discipline. Vitruvius did not merely describe buildings, he attempted to explain the knowledge required to create them. His famous discussion of firmness, utility, and beauty became one of the most enduring ideas in architectural thought. Whether later generations agreed with all of his conclusions is less important than the broader precedent he established. Architecture had become something that could be studied through both reading and practice. For many centuries, however, architectural knowledge remained relatively limited in circulation. Manuscripts were expensive, labor-intensive to produce, and often accessible only to small groups. The spread of architectural ideas accelerated significantly with the development of printing technologies. Once books could be reproduced more efficiently, knowledge could circulate on a much larger scale. The Renaissance became particularly important in this regard. Architectural authors increasingly began producing texts that combined theory, drawing, and practical guidance. Figures such as Leon Battista Alberti, Sebastiano Serlio, and Andrea Palladio contributed to a growing body of literature that helped define architecture as an intellectual discipline. These texts performed several functions simultaneously. They recorded knowledge, communicated ideas, established standards, and shaped professional identities. Perhaps most importantly, they created a shared language through which designers could engage with one another. Architectural knowledge increasingly became part of a broader conversation rather than remaining confined to local traditions. Books also transformed the relationship between teacher and learner. In earlier systems, knowledge often depended upon direct access to an expert. Written texts introduced a new educational dynamic. Students could encounter ideas independently, revisit complex concepts repeatedly, and compare different perspectives. Learning became less dependent on memory and more dependent on interpretation. At the same time, books did not replace practical experience. Reading about design is not the same as designing. Understanding a construction technique intellectually does not automatically produce the ability to execute it successfully. The most effective educational systems, therefore, continued to combine theoretical knowledge with practical engagement. Books expanded learning opportunities, but they did not eliminate the importance of making. This balance remains visible throughout design education today. Students read theories, histories, and technical guides while simultaneously developing practical skills through projects and experimentation. The relationship between knowledge and practice continues to define design pedagogy. Books strengthened one side of that relationship without replacing the other. Another important consequence of written knowledge was standardization. Once ideas were recorded, they could be compared, criticized, revised, and disseminated more systematically. Educational traditions became easier to organize around shared texts and references. Certain works acquired authority and influence, shaping generations of practitioners. Architecture increasingly developed intellectual foundations that extended beyond individual workshops. Yet books also introduced new challenges. Every text reflects particular assumptions, cultural contexts, and historical conditions. Written knowledge can preserve ideas, but it can also privilege certain perspectives while excluding others. Design education, therefore, became not only a process of acquiring knowledge, but also a process of evaluating it critically. Students needed to learn how to interpret texts rather than accept them. This critical dimension would become increasingly important as educational institutions expanded. The growing availability of written knowledge encouraged the development of structured curricula, organized programs of study, and dedicated spaces for learning. As architecture accumulated a larger body of literature, the question of how to teach it became more complex. Books, therefore, did more than preserve architectural knowledge. They helped create the conditions under which formal education could emerge. They connected distant learners to shared intellectual traditions. They transformed architecture from a collection of practices into a field of study. Most importantly, they enabled knowledge to survive beyond individual teachers and individual lifetimes. Understanding this transformation changes how we understand educational history. The development of design education was not driven solely by schools or institutions. It was also shaped by technologies that altered how knowledge moved through society. The book became one of the most powerful educational tools ever created because it allowed learning to transcend both place and time. Seen from this perspective, books represent far more than repositories of information. They are mechanisms of cultural continuity. They preserve conversations across centuries and allow future generations to participate in them. Every student who studies a historical text enters a dialogue that began long before their own education and will likely continue long after it. In the next chapter, we will examine how these developments contributed to the emergence of formal educational institutions. We will explore the rise of academies, the organization of structured curricula, and the growing belief that design could be taught systematically. The discussion will shift from books to schools, from intellectual traditions to educational institutions, and from individual learning to organized programs of study. Because once architectural knowledge could be preserved, shared, and accumulated, the foundations were in place for the creation of the academy. This concludes Chapter 5 of Teaching the Designer, Learning from Books. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.